Hello friends. Welcome back to third part of Country Profiles course. In this course we will cover country profile of Canada and Australia. So let's start with Canada. Oh Canada. Uncle Sam's friendly, environment-loving, French-influenced, semi-frozen buddy up north. It is a place known to have created some of the most amazing things in the world, such as basketball, baseball, maple syrup, and Smarties. Canada, whose geographical area takes up most of North America, extends from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the east to the Pacific Ocean. It is composed of 10 provinces and 3 territories and is considered as one of the world's most developed countries. In terms of landmass, Canada is numero dos in the world right after Russia. Given its sheer size and contributions to the world, you can just imagine how Canada and its domestic currency, the Canadian dollar, are important to forex trading. See the below Canada facts and figures. Here you can check neighbors. Size. Population. Density. Capital city. Head of state. Prime Minister. Currency. Main imports. Main exports. Imports partners. Exports partners. Time zones. And website. Let's come to economic overview. Canada is considered as a resource-based country, which basically means that most of the economic growth it experienced early on came from the utilization and export of its own natural resources. According to the IMF, Canada's economy is the 10th largest in the world, making it part of the world's G8. It ranks as the 7th biggest producer of gold and the 7th largest producer of black crack oil. Despite its robust industrial and manufacturing industry, much of Canada's GDP actually comes from its service sector. Its advanced services sector employs 3 out of every 4 working Canadians and accounts for about 70% of the country's GDP. Next time you meet a Canadian, go ahead and make a bet with him that he works in the services industry. More often than not, you'll win. Canada's economy really got going in January of 1989, when the Free Trade Agreement came into effect. The agreement basically removed all the tariffs, that is the tax imposed on trade, between the US and Canada. In effect, Canada now exports over 70% of its goods to the US. Monetary and fiscal policy. The Bank of Canada, BOC, is the main governing body when it comes to determining the country's monetary policy. Decisions on the monetary policy are made by Governing Council, which is made up of the bank's governor, the senior deputy and 4 other deputy governors. Unlike most other central banks, the BOC doesn't have a set time to make changes on its policies. The council meets every single working day and can alter monetary policy to their liking at any time. The bank's basic mandate is similar to other central banks in that they aim to make sure that the Canadian dollar's value is stable and that the country's inflation rate is within their 1 to 3% target. The BOC does this through open market operations and constant adjustment of the bank rate. The BOC implements its open market operations by using a method called the Large Value Transfer System. The LVTS enables commercial banks all over Canada to borrow and lend money to each other so that they could go about their daily operations. Now, the interest rate charged on these transactions is called the bank rate. By altering the bank rate, the BOC can basically control the flow of money in the economy. By altering the bank rate, the BOC can basically control the flow of money in the economy. To illustrate this, let's say the bank rate is set at 2.00%. In one of its meetings, the BOC realizes that the CAD is losing value much faster than expected, which is causing businesses to increase the prices of goods they sell and the services they offer. The BOC then decides to raise the bank rate to 2.50%. By hiking the bank rate, the interest needed to be paid to lenders increases, in turn, reduces the likelihood of banks, businesses, and consumers of taking additional debt. Now, since there is less money in the pockets of consumers, the chance of them spending is decreased, preventing any further inflation. What business in their right mind would increase prices when nobody is buying, right? Getting to know the CAD. You might be wondering why the CAD is nicknamed after Canada's national bird, the loonie. Well, that's because that's the engraved design on Canada's coins. Check out these other cool properties of the loonie. The black crack in me. Historically, the price of black crack has been highly correlated with the US dollar to Canadian dollar. The general rule is that whenever oil prices start climbing, the CAD usually follows. If the price of oil is projected to increase over the next couple of years, then you'd want to go sell the US dollar to Canadian dollar. My work hours are short. The US dollar to Canadian dollar has been known to move in tight ranges for the most part of the day. It is only when US traders are eating their Cheerios during the overlap of the European trading session and the US trading session that the pair begins to move. Unlike my BFF, the USD. A key factor to look at when trading the US dollar to Canadian dollar is that its direction is closely tied to the US economy. Remember, more than being close neighbors, the US and Canada engage in heavy trade with each other. When the US economy experiences robust growth, the Canadian economy is usually just right behind it. So whenever you decide to trade the CAD, take some time off to see how well, or poorly, the US is doing. But I'm still feisty during the US session. The CAD usually doesn't start moving until the US trading session, around 1 p.m. GMT. The CAD offers little movement during the Asian trading session and the morning European trading session. Important economic indicators for the CAD. Consumer Price Index, CPI, similar to other central banks, the Bank of Canada's objective is to make sure that inflation does not get out of hand. Since the Consumer Price Index tracks the increase, or decrease, in the prices of consumer goods and services, the report is closely watched by currency traders. Gross Domestic Product, GDP, the GDP is the broadest measure of Canada's economic activity. It reveals whether the country is growing or not. Trade balance, just like other commodity-based countries, Canada's economy is highly susceptible to changes in its export and import activities. Ivy Purchasing Managers Index, PMI. The PMI is a survey designed to see whether businesses are optimistic or pessimistic about the economy. A reading above baseline 50.0 means that conditions in the business sector is growing, while a reading below 50.0 indicates otherwise. What moves the CAD? U.S. economic data. U.S. economic data usually prints roughly at the same time as Canadian data. On the one hand, the negative data from the US coupled with positive data from Canada could lead to a massive drop in the US dollar to Canadian dollar's value. On the other hand, positive US data and poor Canadian data could send the US dollar to Canadian dollar soaring high. Mergers and acquisitions. Because of the proximity between the US and Canada, company mergers and acquisitions happen quite often. These cause a huge amount of money to flow between the two countries, which create a significant effect on the foreign exchange market. For example, in order for a U.S. company to buy out a Canadian company, it must first exchange its U.S. dollars to Canadian dollars to complete the transaction. Imagine the amount of money that flows through the foreign exchange market just to seal the deal. Trading the U.S. dollar to Canadian dollar. U.S. dollar to Canadian dollar is traded in amounts denominated in USD. Standard lot sizes are 100,000 US dollars and mini lot sizes are 10,000 US dollars. The pip value, which is denominated in Canadian dollars, is calculated by dividing 1 pip of US dollar to Canadian dollar, that's 0.0001, by US dollar to Canadian dollar's current rate. Profit and loss are denominated in Canadian dollars. For one standard lot position size, each pip movement is worth 10 Canadian dollars. For one mini lot position size, each pip movement is worth 1 Canadian dollar. For example, if the current exchange rate of US dollar to Canadian dollar is 1.1000 and you want to trade one standard lot, then 1 pip would equate to $9.90. Margin calculations are based in US dollars. With a leverage of 100 to 1, 1,000 US dollars is needed to trade used 100,000/CAD. US dollar to Canadian dollar trading tactics. Since US dollar to Canadian dollar is only active during the US trading session, the pair is highly susceptible to fake-outs during the other two trading sessions. This means that a break in a significant support level in the US dollar to Canadian dollar during the morning European trading session would, more often than not, simply be a fake-out. Watching the differences in the results of economic data between the US and Canada is also a great practice to determine where the US dollar to Canadian dollar is headed. Because both in US and Canadian data are released just a few hours or minutes apart, variances in results tend to result in exaggerated one-directional moves. For instance, negative US data coupled with positive Canadian data would be a good reason to sell US dollar to Canadian dollar. Lastly, beyond looking at economic data, Spending some time to analyze oil price behavior would help a lot in trading the CAD. Since Canada is considered as one of the world's major black crack oil producers, changes in its price create quite a hefty impact on the CAD's value. In fact, since 1988, the exchange rate of US dollar to Canadian dollar and the price of oil have been inversely correlated by as much as 68%. How can you use this to your advantage? Well, if you notice that over time that oil prices at your local gasoline station are rising, it could give you the additional confirmation you need to short the US dollar to Canadian dollar. Let's move to Australia profile. Officially considered as the world's biggest island, Australia is the only country on Earth that governs an entire continent. Before the coming of settlers from Europe in 1788, Aboriginal people inhabited most of the country. Since then, people from all over the world have migrated to Australia, which has made it one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. Now, Australia is home to people from 200 different countries. Lastly, and probably most importantly, Australia is known for producing the meanest and most hardcore actors of all time like Mel Gibson, the Braveheart, Hugh Jackman, the Wolverine, and the legendary Heath Ledger, the Joker. To add to that, they also have mech kangaroos, battle tank armadillos, and bomber pelicans. You can see how the rest of the world really had no choice but to name an entire continent after them. Let's look into Australia, facts, figures, and features. Here you check your neighbors. Size. Density. Capital city. Head of state. Head of government. Currency. Main imports. Main exports. Import partners. Export partners. Time zone. Website. Let's move into economic overview. Compared to G7 nations, Australia's overall economy is relatively small. According to the World Bank, however, on a per-person basis, its GDP is even higher than the UK, Germany and even the US. In the past 15 years or so, Australia's economy has grown an average of 3.6% annually, well above the 2.5% world norm. No wonder it ranked third overall in the Legatum Institute's 2011 Prosperity Index. Australia's economy is highly service-oriented, with over 70% of its GDP coming from industries such as finance, education, and tourism. Despite having a very robust export industry and stellar growth, Australia has been notoriously famous for consistently having a high current account deficit. This means that Australia is using up more resources from other economies to satisfy its own domestic consumption. Monetary AMP, fiscal policy. The Reserve Bank of Australia is the main governing body of Australia when it comes to monetary and fiscal policy. The RBA's aim is threefold. Keep exchange rates stable. Ensure growth. Maintain full employment. In order to do this, the bank believes that the country's annual inflation rate must be kept within 2 to 3%. By keeping a tight rein on inflation, the value of their domestic currency is secured, which will eventually lead to sustainable economic growth. How does the RBA make sure inflation is controlled? 2 ways: adjusting the cash rate and conducting open market operations. The cash rate is the interest rate charged by lending banks on overnight loans to other financial institutions. Open market operations, on the other hand, is the way the RBA controls money supply through the buying and selling of government loans or other financial assets. With the exception of January, the RBA meets monthly to discuss what changes it will make to monetary policy. To make this easier to swallow, take this simple example. Let's say that inflation in Australia is increasing much faster than what the bank wants. In order to suppress the high inflation rate, the bank decides to raise the cash rate, which will effectively increase the cost of borrowing by borrowers. Naturally, this move will tone down lending, lessening the overall money in circulation. And basic supply and demand tells us that the scarcer something is, the more valuable it is. Getting to know the odd. Even though they've got their seasons mixed up, the Australians are always up bright and early to play. Well, this is mostly because the Australian market is the first to open every week. Just like the people inhabiting the place, Australia's local currency, the odd, is called the Aussie. I'm called a commodity dollar for a reason. One important characteristic of the odd is that it has a high positive correlation with gold prices. The reason behind this is that Australia is the third biggest gold producer in the world. As a result, Whenever the price of gold rises or falls, the odd goes along for the ride. And I'm one of the best candidates for carry trade. Among the major currencies, the odd has been known for having a high interest rate. This makes it a favorite for carry trade. Carry trade is the practice of buying a currency with a high interest rate in exchange for a currency with a lower interest rate. I'm only awake a couple of hours a day. Most of the odds movement happens during the Asian trading session, the time when economic data from Australia is released. But bad weather is one of my worst enemies. Given the commodity-based economy of Australia, unfavorable weather conditions tend to put a serious strain on Australia's growth, which leads to a sell-off in the odd. How severely do weather conditions affect the odd? Well, let's just say that during the Australian drought of 2002, Australian dollar to US dollar fell to 0.4770, that is almost half its current exchange rate. Important economic indicators for Australia. Consumer Price Index, because the RBA's primary goal is controlling inflation, the CPI, which measures the overall change in price of consumer goods and services, is closely watched by the bank. Balance of trade. Australia has an extremely robust trade sector, so currency traders and bank officials alike tend to watch changes in the country's export and import levels. Gross domestic product. This measures how well Australia's economy is doing. Positive readings indicate economic growth while negative readings mean economic contraction. Unemployment rate. The unemployment rate tracks how many people in Australia's labour force are out of work. The number of people employed, or rather, unemployed in this cause, has a high correlation with economic activity. A person without a job means he has less money available for spending. What moves the odd? Economic and interest rate outlook. The odd is greatly affected by macroeconomic factors such as monetary policy rhetoric, interest rates, and domestic economic data. In trading the odd, always pay special attention to the interest rate outlook. Comments made by officials from the RBA regarding interest rates, for instance, could create a hefty impact on the odd. China's economy. For the better part of the last decade, China has been on a roll, posting some massive growth figures. In order to create finished goods, China sources a lot of its raw materials like coal and iron ore from Australia. For China to buy raw materials from Australia, it must first need to exchange its local currency for the odd. This means that increased demand for Chinese goods tend to prop up the odd's value. Likewise, a decline in demand for Chinese products could lead to a fall in the odd's value. New Zealand data. To a lesser extent, data from New Zealand influences the odd's price action. Take note that New Zealand's economy is very similar to Australia, which makes their currency positively correlated. In fact, the relationship of the two countries is sometimes described as trans-Tasman to show how closely tied their economies are and to indicate the existence of the Tasman Sea sitting right between them. With that said, it is important to be aware of important upcoming data from New Zealand as it could indirectly cause the odd to move. Trading Australian dollar to US dollar. Australian dollar to US dollar is traded in amounts denominated in odd. Standard lot sizes are 100,000 Australian dollars and mini lot sizes are 10,000 Australian dollars. The pip value, which is denominated in US dollars, is calculated by dividing 1 pip of Australian dollar to US dollar, that's 0.0001, by the Australian dollar to US dollar's current rate. Profit and loss are denominated in US dollars. For one standard lot position size, each pip movement is worth 10 US dollars. For one mini lot position size, each pip movement is worth 1 US dollar. Margin calculations are based in US dollars. For example, if the current Australian dollar to US dollar rate is 0.9000 and the leverage is 100 to 1, 900 US dollars is needed in available margin to be able to trade on standard lot of 100,000 Australian dollars. However, as Australian dollar to US dollar rises, a larger available margin in USD is required. Conversely, the lower Australian dollar to US dollar rate is, the less required available margin is needed. Australian dollar to US dollar trading tactics. Since the odd is one of the best candidates for carry trade, which is the buying of a currency with high interest rates and the selling of a currency with low interest rates, Australian dollar to US dollar is highly affected by crosses. How can you use this to your advantage? Well, if you see a break of a significant technical support level in Australian dollar to Japanese yen, that could be a good sign to sell Australian dollar to US dollar. Another thing to consider when trading oddest is data coming out from New Zealand. Because of Australia's nearness and trade relations with New Zealand, positive economic data from New Zealand usually helps push the odd's value up. This means that better than expected New Zealand economic reports could be seen as a good signal to buy the odd. Conversely, poor economic data from New Zealand could be a reason to sell the odd. Lastly, take some time to look at how commodity prices, especially gold, are doing. More often than not, the price of gold leads the odd. This means that whenever the gold rises in value, Australian dollar to US dollar could rally soon after. Of course, when the value of gold falls, the odd also tends follows suit. So friends, this video is completed here. Remaining countries will be covered in next part. So stay tuned.